is pretty stark. So I hope that New Hampshire voters will listen to both of us and then make up their minds about who they think can actually deliver what we are advocating.
But when you look deeper into these numbers in the latest poll, one of the issues, and perhaps the biggest issue, boils down to trust. Do you feel like that there's still an argument that you need to make that you can be trusted with some of these issues that people keep talking about, whether it's the emails or whatever?
Well, Josh, I want to make the case that people in New Hampshire can count on me. You know, after our hard-fought election in 2008, President-elect Obama turned to me and asked me to be his Secretary of State. He trusted me. He counted on me. The people of New York elected me in 2000 by a very good margin and then came back when I ran for re-election and gave me even a higher margin. The people who know me and don't just listen to the barrage of incoming attacks that, you know, I understand, I appreciate as part of the political atmosphere. People who know me, people who have worked with me. That's why I have so many colleagues from the Senate. I have the governor of Vermont. I have Senator Leahy from Vermont. People who are supporting me because they've worked with me, they know me, they trust me. And I want the people of New Hampshire to know that when I tell you I'll fight for you, I will, and you can count on that. And that's the kind of person I am, and that's the kind of president I'll be.
You talk about these attacks. Obviously, some of them come from other candidates in the field. Some of them come from the media. It seems like every couple of days there's a new report where an indictment from the FBI is imminent because there's a document that was in her emails that's definitely classified. Nothing ever really happens with that. But let me ask you first, is there ever going to be anything more to that story? And two, how do you make people not worry about it?
Well, there isn't anything to the story. I can't control the story. I can't control the very well-timed political leaks and everything else that seems to be going on. But what I've said for months remains absolutely true. I did not send or receive any material marked classified. I take that very seriously. I've handled a lot of it. There are things that, you know, only I and a handful of people know about. I was one of the very few in the Situation Room to advise the president about bin Laden. So top secret that when the president called to tell all the former presidents and he reached my husband, he said, well, I assume that Hillary has told you. And Bill said, no, no. So I know how to handle the kind of information that needs to be kept carefully out of the public arena. But in this latest incident, which really is quite strange, the best we can tell is that these efforts to retroactively classify material that was not marked classified at the time includes a New York Times article that somebody forwarded to me. Honestly, I just think that there's an effort.
Part of the game.
It's part. Sure. Well, it's a sad game, but I know that these kinds of political back and forth will continue.
Let me just ask you this. A couple of important issues. Obviously, we have to get to a lot of important issues, but no one's perfect. You've been in the public eye for decades now. Do you fear that the scandals that the Clinton name has endured, whether you're involved with them or not, might be hurting you still?
Well, I don't think so, but of course that's up to every individual voter. I went through some really hard times personally in the late 90s. The whole world knows that. I've written about it in my autobiography, Living History. But I am very proud of my husband, the marriage we have, the daughter we raised, the granddaughter who's the light of our life. So I will, you know, stand up for all of the really good things that Bill did as president, which still gets crowds to come to see him here in New Hampshire and Iowa and elsewhere. Because I think everybody, as you said in your question, Josh, there are no perfect people. And I don't think any of us should be judged by the worst mistake or action that we did. We ought to have a little more charity and understanding, since every one of us needs it from time to time. So if people want to listen to the Republicans who kind of stirred this up and started it all over again, that is certainly every voter's right. But I would ask them to look at what the economic results were in the 1990s and the kind of plans I'm putting forward that will get incomes rising, and will enable more people to lift themselves up, because I believe in economic empowerment, that's the real lesson that should be drawn when it comes to looking at the future.
Yeah, and you talk about green energy possibly being something like the next internet. We'll see. Let me ask you about foreign policy. Not long ago, I asked you about the Iran nuclear deal, and basically your words, you said, on balance, it is in America's best interest.
That's
this
right.
week, the Secretary of State, John Kerry, said, with the lifting of the sanctions, it's likely that billions of dollars could find their way into the pockets of terrorist groups. So when you look at that, and as we learn more about this, do you have any, how would you second guess, or would you change the deal that's in place right now?
Well, you know, I feel strongly that the deal that was reached, since I had a big diplomatic role in getting the sanctions imposed and laying the groundwork for the negotiations, does put a lid on the Iranian nuclear weapons program. But as I have said repeatedly, you can't just sign the agreement and go home. We have to enforce it, every single provision of it. I would intend as president to impose consequences on the Iranians if we discover that there are problems that they are engaged in that raise red flags. I immediately called for sanctions on their missile development program, because they should not be doing that, and we have to try to send that signal to them. So on the nuclear weapons piece of the complicated relationship with Iran, I feel like if we enforce it, we can make it work. There is, however, this other huge area of problems with Iran. You know, when they seized our sailors and took those videos, I was outraged. When they have done things to destabilize other countries, their continuing support for Assad, who is murdering hundreds of thousands of his own people. There is so much about Iranian behavior that we have to be vigilant about and try to bring the world together to deal with that, just as I brought the world together on the sanctions. So I'm not one of those, as my esteemed opponent, Senator Sanders, has said, who wants to rush to normalize relations with Iran. No, we got where we are with respect to the nuclear weapons program by very patient, very careful, deliberate diplomacy. I want us to do the same on trying to prevent their support of terrorism, trying to prevent them from destabilizing the Middle East.
We only have a couple of minutes to go. You touched on what Bernie Sanders has said about diplomacy. Let me ask you about, obviously, he's a former independent, now running as a Democrat. Do you believe he represents the philosophy of the Democratic Party?
Well, you really will have to ask him, because, you know, that is his philosophy. He has to describe it. Well, here's what I think. I think that we know more about what to do to provide economic opportunity that actually is delivered. We don't need, you know, theories or ideas that sound great, but are going to be really hard, if not impossible, to ever implement. I want us to work through gridlock by making it clear, you know, I don't have a monopoly on good ideas, but I do have an idea that I think is pretty well founded in evidence about how we get the economy really working for everybody, how we promote small businesses, how we do more on clean energy with all the jobs that has, how we change the tax code so that we have incentives to bring manufacturing back to New Hampshire and America. So I've been very clear about what I will do to create jobs. And I also have, by many observers' views, the toughest, most comprehensive plan to rein in Wall Street. I know that's, you know, one of the big deals of my opponents, and I agree with him, but we passed Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank gives the president and the Federal Reserve the authority to go after big banks that pose systemic risks. I've said, great, we'll do that if it's called for. But now we've also got to go after the shadow banking industry. Remember, it was investment banks and big insurance companies and others who had a major role in the Great Recession.
Well, best of luck to you moving forward. We're out of time. You certainly do have plenty of support here in New Hampshire.
Oh, it feels great. I really love being in this state. So I'm going to be here, as my husband would say, till the last dog dies.
Okay. Best of luck to you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.